Hi everybody, it's Dr. Nichols-Boyle. So in this video, I'm going to focus on the context for Condy Cullen and then go over some key scenes to help you understand exactly what happened and how he tricked the Gauger and ultimately won this battle of the wits. So first I want to start by giving you a bit of context into what kind of tradition that Carleton is entering here. So he's entering the tradition of the trickster tale. And I mentioned this a little bit before, but I want to go into a bit more detail so you can see what the traditional way of this tale was and how Carleton kind of changes it a little bit for the context. So the trickster tale is a bit like what it seems. It started out in the oral tradition, and it always deals with some kind of trickery. But generally, traditionally, it dealt with the main character, the protagonist. This is from the Encyclopedia Britannica here, which was often an anthropomorphized animal or an animal that had human-like characteristics, like he could talk and walk and all those kinds of things, or she, who has magical powers and had kind of had a lot of different characteristics. So he would be very powerful, but also seem like an idiot, be an innocent fool, and be kind of a childish prankster, even though he was capable of great destruction and those kinds of things. So he would be an unlikely hero, the trickster hero. And generally, what he would be used at is as a poor example. So of things that you shouldn't do, and usually his boastfulness or his stupidity or something like that would get him into trouble and give an example of what you were not to do. So this is the kind of idea of it. He usually meets a violent or ludicrous end. However, in Carleton's tradition, in the Irish tradition, he takes this idea and kind of twists it a little bit. And this also happens in the African tradition as well. So when they talk about the African tradition, which we have Brer Rabbit, in Native American it was often a coyote or raven, in Japanese a fox, but the Brer Rabbit. So this produces a kind of a new trickster tale. And this is very similar to the way we see Condy Cullen. So this trickster is still sometimes a little bit ridiculous, or seemingly so, but he's always the underdog. He's usually smaller in stature and strength than his opponents. We can think of Condy here, and gains the audience's sympathy, but he's always much cleverer and always well in control of the situation. In these cases, his prey, or who he's trying to trick, is usually earnest, hardworking, and slow-witted. So we could see that maybe a bit in Legends of Knockmany, with the giants, right? And maybe even with the Englishman to some extent, how he is able to then yield to the smooth arguments and attractive promises of his opponent. So Brer Rabbit's opponents are usually the ones who instigate conflict. So there's the outsiders, forcing him to rely upon his charm, speed, diminutive size, and guile, and characteristics that usually save him from trouble and sometimes get him into some difficulty. So again, I think we can see that connection with Carleton and Condy Cullen. So the idea here is that Carleton takes that kind of trickster tale of this ridiculous hero who usually gets his comeuppance and turns it around into that ridiculousness and stupidity only being a pretend, and that he's playing into those assumptions by the outsider in order to actually win and use his wits he hides his cleverness and then ends up actually being the hero and achieving victory in the end. So Carleton, I think you can see how he, and in the African situation, both of them being colonized by the British, by the way, in different situations, would have seen this kind of message as being really useful. So these kinds of tales are often common in minority or colonized culture. First from the oral tradition. Often these kinds of cultures are later to get an education or to read and attain literacy. And then also, I think, because of the message that's coming across. So Carleton is consciously entering and using the trickster tradition in his work. And that leads us to talking about the hidden transcript. So you can follow along with these notes that I provided in the module as well to see this. So with the hidden transcript, this is actually a theory by sociologist James C. Scott that in minority or colonized cultures where there is a great discrepancy in power, so there's a great power difference, members of the minority culture will speak or behave very differently in the presence of those from their own culture, who they consider equals or peers, than in the presence of those from the dominant culture or those with more power. So this idea, he was actually talking about a different group, the Malaysians, Malay people, from a longer time ago, from also around in the 1700s, 1800s. But this can equally be applied to the Irish situation. And you might think, well, this doesn't sound all that groundbreaking, but you'll see, I think, why it applies. So the private transcript is the one that's more hidden. Okay, so there's speech and behavior in the private transcript is how you behave or speak when you're amongst your peers, your equals, members of your own culture. So this would not be seen by those outside your culture. It's something that you keep hidden. And then in the public transcript is speech or behavior when you're amongst more powerful members of the dominant culture, or the majority culture. And you might think, again, the idea that Scott has is that you practice sort of in the private transcript the way you are going to behave in the public one, and that there's sometimes a hidden meaning in that public one too that is not as authentic. That public behavior is not as authentic. And again, one of the things that people often talk about is like, well, I don't really understand minority culture in terms of, they say, the Irish Catholics. There were more of them than the Protestant ruling class, right? But when we talk about minority cultures, what we mean is those who are in the minority of power for the most part, and are considered as lower status than the people who have the power. So that is what constitutes more of a minority culture, and in this case being colonized as well by the British. So we all have this kind of duality to some extent. So we have, for example, you behave differently with your fellow students than when you would have a conversation with your professor, right? You behave differently with your fellow employees at work than you would when you're with your boss. So we all have a little bit of a difference in our private and public transcript, ways that we are with our friends and with our parents. So we alter our behavior and speech in some ways. But the same way, you can recognize that that's the same person, right? You can see a lot of overlap there, and these are relatively small differences. But in these situations, what we're saying is that it's much more obvious, and that public behavior is often inauthentic, and it's a constructed, purposeful behavior in order to maybe achieve something, or to navigate a situation where you don't have the control in the cases of colonization. So this discrepancy, the difference is far greater. So if we look at public transcript examples in terms of the way that Scott describes them, and in the way that we might think of them in the Irish, these are things like in the public transcript. I have some examples here in the notes that I will explain a little bit more. But it's all things that take place in sort of the oral context, nothing recorded or written. So it might be pilfering, like stealing things, petty theft, nothing major, vandalism, or foot dragging is one of the things I put here. And to give that a little context, what this means is basically finding ways to obstruct and kind of make things more difficult without causing major damage that you could really get in trouble for if you were caught, right? So vandalism, it's a crime, but it's not that big of a deal. So these would be the kinds of things if, say, for example, the Irish would get paid by the day, right? For how long they worked. And sometimes they would be made to do things that were quite unfair, like having to work their landlord's land for long periods of time instead of concentrating on bringing in their own crops. So instead, what they would do is, one, they would try to foot drag or make tasks take longer than they should, and just appear not to be good at them. And that way you get paid for longer, right? So that kind of thing was one example of a public transcript. It comes across as you're just an idiot who doesn't really know how to do things right. But you're benefiting by getting that. Or if it was something that you didn't want to do and you were resentful about, um, then you might, make some kind something break. Um, like in modern days, it would be a tractor. In those days, it would be maybe doing something to the plow or something along those lines, or you know hurting the crops because they're not your crops anyway. So these kinds of ways it's slowly getting back at people. Other examples would be things that were more spoken, like giving out nicknames to people that were really quite cruel, but they may not understand because you're sort of an inside joke about it. Um, and you'll see it in Carlton's Condy Cullen that we'll look at. He calls one of the Gages Old Nick, which is a nickname for the devil, but the Irish knew this and the English didn't. So you could do things like that. Gossip, again, I heard somewhere something this is saying things about people behind their back, but it's hard to trace to one person. Or again, songs, and you saw this in other kinds of cultures too, like in African cultures, where especially when the slaves later on, the idea of a song that had double meaning. So this seemed like they're always happy and singing, but really that song was about oppression or rebellion in some way, using kind of coded language. And oral tales as well, tales like maybe a legend of Doc Vanny or something along those lines, where, as I mentioned, you might pretend that it's just a fairy tale, but really it has a message that could inspire people that is a little bit subversive. In all of these cases, you'll notice these things are easily explainable and easily deniable. So that's the kind of key to why this sort of thing took place the way it did. So outright rebellion, actually fighting against people, is risky because then they know what side you're on. You can't deny it. You went after somebody with a weapon, right? And if you lose, then the consequences are huge for you. So Scott's idea, and I think it's a good one, is that most people instead, what they do is these kind of small, subtle ways of rebelling, and they hide them from their oppressor or the person in more dominant culture. And there's a couple of things to kind of note about this and to think about. So one, this could be dangerous or damaging long term if it's misinterpreted. If you're always pretending to be stupid and not really understand things and not be capable of doing things well, that might be the way people see you, right? And that stereotype might in a way become true, even if it's just a conceit, even if it's just something you're pretending to do. So long term, that could be a problem, although it might get you some short term gain. And it's also something that you might think, well, this doesn't sound very, very honorable or truthful. And in a way, you're right. But for the minority culture, many times these kinds of acts were still considered acceptable because they felt the system was unfair. So if there's no way for me to get ahead anyway, is it really so wrong that I undermine these other people's methods of getting ahead because I shouldn't be having to work their land? I shouldn't be having to pay extra money when they're taking all my money from me to get a license for alcohol. Those kinds of things, right? So they consider it, by their ethics, it would be acceptable because the system is rigged against them, right? So this kind of leads to that question that we see in Condy. In some ways, it's a bit unusual that most of us, I think, and certainly Carlton, I think, wants us to believe, if we look at the language, that we should root for Condy, that we should kind of want him to win, right? He's funny. We want him to see him get away with the tricks, I think. And in the way that the Gager and Condy Cullen described, if you look closely at the language, I think you can see that he wants the audience really to side with Condy. But really, that's kind of a strange idea, because why should we root for the guy who's breaking the law, right? The Gager's just doing his job, and Condy is tricking him and is being deceitful. So why should we do that? And I think it goes back maybe to these ideas of the trickster tale, about rooting for the underdog, about seeing some of the unfairness in the situation, especially when we see that the gauger is taking bribes and is not necessarily completely on the up and up himself. So that gives us some kind of context to this. And you might disagree, and that's okay. You might say, you know what, I think that the gauger was hard done by, and he was just, behaving in the way that he should for his position, and Condy is being unfair. And that's okay too. There is that reading in the text. And maybe it's a little bit important that there is that kind of a reading, or that we see it as something more innocent on the Condy's part, or not deliberative, if you consider that Carleton's audience was also English and may see be on the side of the gauger, right? So that gives you a little bit about the context and understanding the history here of the people who didn't have many rights, and why this kind of thing might apply to them in understanding the story. So we're going to move from there to talking more about the scenes in the story. So I think I'm going to stop there and leave that for another video, so that way we can separate the two.